Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
I want you to picture an astronaut. Just, close your eyes for a second and imagine one.
Right, everyone kind of goes to the same image.
Exactly. You are probably seeing a human in a bulky white spacesuit.
All right.
Maybe a reflection of the lunar surface in their gold visor. It's that classic iconic imagery. But I want you to completely erase that picture.
Oh, totally wipe the slate clean.
Yeah, instead I want you to picture a tiny, 8-legged, incredibly fuzzy spider knot.
Which, is definitely a completely different paradigm for a space pioneer.
It really is. So in 2012, 2 actual jumping spiders were packed up and launched to the International Space Station. And our mission for today's deep dive is to look at the sources detailing this strange experiment.
Because it's not just a weird science fair project,
No, not at all. Figuring out how a tiny predator adapts to the void actually holds the biological blueprint for how humans might one day live on Mars. Okay, let's unpack this because I have to admit, looking at the physics of this, I have a major bone to pick with the scientists who designed this test.
Really? What is the primary issue you see with it?
Well, jumping spiders are essentially tiny biological acrobats. Their entire method of survival, their whole evolutionary script, is built around gravity.
Right. They're entirely dependent on it.
Exactly. They don't spin webs to catch food. They calculate complex parabolic arcs to ambush their prey. So sending a creature whose existence relies entirely on gravity into a zero-gravity environment seems like a guaranteed failure.
It does sound counterintuitive at first glance.
It's like asking a human being to play a highly competitive game of basketball on a freshly polished ice rink while wearing socks. We sent mice, dogs, and primates into space to test the physical limits of mammalian survival. But why choose a creature whose primary tool, gravity, is being completely stripped away?
See, that perceived flaw is actually the exact reason they were chosen. We didn't just scoop up random garden spiders for a novelty stunt.
I would hope not.
Right. We selected these creatures specifically because their evolutionary reliance on gravity makes them the ultimate stress test for sensory adaptation.
Ah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, in the early days of spaceflight with primates and dogs, scientists were testing gross physiological limits. Could lungs process oxygen during extreme acceleration? Could a heart pump blood without gravity assisting the downward flow?
Basically, just trying to see if a complex organism would survive the launch at all. The fundamental, will this kill us immediately phase of rocketry.
Exactly. But by 2012, our ambitions had grown. We needed to understand neurobiology and spatial awareness.
We were past the basics.
Way past them. We needed to know how an Earth-evolved brain processes an environment where the fundamental rules of physics are suddenly broken. So we chose 2 highly specific candidates: Nefertiti, a female Johnson jumping spider, and Cleopatra, a zebra jumping spider.
And one of our sources provides an incredibly vivid quote to help you visualize these specific species. It says, imagine a rainbow-colored kitten, shrink it down to the size of your fingertip, and add a few more legs.
Which perfectly captures their dual nature, I think. They appear fuzzy and almost endearing.
They are kind of cute in a weird way.
They are. But mechanically, they're highly efficient, calculating killers. Jumping spiders have 4 pairs of eyes, giving them a near 360-degree field of vision.
Wow.
And they hunt using hydraulic pressure in their legs to propel themselves. What's fascinating here is that sending them to the ISS allowed us to test neurological plasticity in real time.
So it's about seeing how the brain rewires itself.
Exactly. By taking away the one constant variable they've always known, which is gravity, scientists could monitor how quickly a brain can rewrite its own software to process a totally alien environment.
Okay, but if the core question is how animals process a sudden lack of gravity, I have to assume jumping spiders weren't the only way to test this, because another detail in our source material seems completely absurd on its face.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to bring up.
NASA didn't just send spiders. They once sent over 2,000 baby jellyfish into space.
And those jellyfish serve as the perfect biological counterpoint to Nefertiti and Cleopatra.
Wait, I need to challenge this whole setup. The source notes that those 2,000 baby jellyfish actually reproduced in orbit, and tens of thousands of them came back to Earth.
A massive population boom, yeah.
If you have tens of thousands of jellyfish reproducing in orbit alongside hunting spiders, what kind of chaotic environment are we actually talking about?
Yeah.
We usually picture the ISS as this sterile, Highly controlled laboratory. This sounds like a zero-gravity zoo where everything is just breeding and floating around.
I know it sounds wild, but the environment is meticulously controlled in isolated habitats. The sheer volume of life is necessary for the data, though.
Okay, so they weren't just floating through the cafeteria.
No, but think about how a jellyfish functions. They don't have eyes like a jumping spider. They rely on internal microscopic calcium pockets called statoliths.
Daedalus, okay.
Yeah, and gravity pulls these heavy calcium crystals down to the bottom of the pocket, which tells the jellyfish's nervous system which way is the ocean floor and which way is the surface.
Oh, so they possess a built-in biological plumb bob.
That is the perfect analogy. So when they reproduce in space, scientists want to observe the generational effect of microgravity.
What happens to the babies going up there?
Well, the spaceborne jellyfish developed those calcium pockets, but because there was no gravity to pull the crystals down during their development, the nervous system never learned how to read the signals.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so when those spaceborne jellyfish were brought back to Earth, they couldn't swim properly. They were completely disoriented because their hardware developed in an environment without the very force it was designed to measure.
That is wild. The jellyfish proved that without gravity during development, the internal compass never calibrates, which honestly makes what happened with our spider knots even more impressive.
It really does put it in perspective.
Let's look at the actual 100-day microgravity marathon on the ISS, because Nefertiti completely defied the kind of biological failure we just saw with the jellyfish.
Her performance shattered expectations regarding what a tiny invertebrate brain is capable of achieving.
First, the sheer endurance. Nefertiti spent 100 days in space, setting a massive record for the longest time spent off Earth by an arachnid.
And you have to remember, for a creature that only lives about a year, 100 days is a huge percentage of its total lifespan.
It's like a human spending decades up there. But the real breakthrough was watching her eat. The scientists sent up fruit flies for her, and she successfully hunted them. She overcame the lack of gravity and went right back to being an apex predator.
To appreciate the magnitude of that success, we really have to break down the mechanics of the hunt.
Right, because the physics change entirely.
Completely. On Earth, a jumping spider pushes off a surface, and gravity creates the parabolic arc that brings them down onto their prey.
Up and then back down.
Exactly. But in microgravity, Newton's laws dictate that if you push off a wall, you will simply continue in a straight line forever until you hit another surface.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because jumping without gravity is like flying a commercial jet when your altimeter completely breaks.
You're just flying blind.
Yes. You can no longer rely on your instruments to tell you where the ground is. You have to look out the window and manually calculate the math with your own eyes to avoid crashing. Or it's like trying to catch a floating grape with chopsticks while riding a roller coaster. How does a spider do that?
Well, our sources mention a related study about tarantulas combining learning-based navigation with cue-based orientation.
Right, I saw that. How does that apply here?
That study is the key to understanding Nefertiti. Cue-based orientation relies on fixed environmental signals, like gravity pulling on the spider's exoskeleton.
The built-in hardware signals, like the jellyfish.
Exactly. When that cue vanishes, a purely instinctual creature would starve. It would just launch itself, miss the fly, bounce off the wall, and fail. But tarantulas, and by extension jumping spiders, possess learning-based navigation.
So they can figure it out on the fly, literally.
Yes. When the gravity cue went dark, Nefertiti's brain realized the old software was failing.
But I need to push back on the biology here. If a tarantula's entire evolutionary history, over millions of years, is written around the constant downward pull of Earth, taking that away shouldn't trigger learning.
You'd think it would just break them.
Right. It should trigger a total system failure, just like the jellyfish. How does an organism bridge a gap it has literally never encountered in its entire genetic history?
It does so through sheer neuroplasticity. The spider's brain actively rerouted its neural pathways.
Just spontaneously.
Yes. Since the physical sensation of gravity was gone, the visual cortex had to take over the mathematical heavy lifting. Nefertiti used her 4 pairs of eyes to calculate distance, trajectory, and interception.
That is incredible.
She had to learn through trial and error to push off with a fraction of her usual force so she wouldn't overshoot the floating fruit fly. She recalibrated her internal physics engine in real time.
So, a fingertip-sized creature essentially taught itself orbital mechanics just to get breakfast.
That's one way to put it, yeah. It proves that the flexibility of life is far deeper than we assumed. An organism doesn't need millions of years of evolution to adapt to microgravity if its brain is wired to constantly solve spatial puzzles.
Well, she mastered the zero-gravity hunt for 100 days. But every space mission eventually faces the most violent phase of the journey, the return.
Moving from the triumph of survival in orbit to the harsh physics of coming back to Earth.
Right, and our sources note the tragic reality of this specific mission. Cleopatra, the zebra-jumping spider, did not survive the return trip to Earth.
Re-entry is incredibly unforgiving. The transition back to a 1G environment is a brutal shock to a physiological system that has just spent months dismantling its Earth-based defenses.
What actually happens to them physically during that drop?
You are dealing with extreme, sustained G-forces, intense mechanical vibration, and a sudden, crushing return of gravity. In microgravity, fluids shift throughout the body, and muscles atrophy because they aren't fighting resistance.
Because everything is weightless.
Exactly. So suddenly slamming all that weight back onto an unconditioned exoskeleton is catastrophic.
Yet, Nefertiti made history again. She survived the violent re-entry and became the first spider to survive the voyage home. She didn't just survive the landing, she successfully readjusted to Earth's gravity.
She underwent a double recalibration. Think about that.
Rewiring again.
Yeah, her brain had to abandon the zero-gravity software she'd just spent 100 days perfecting and frantically reinstall the Earth gravity protocols.
So she lands, survives the double recalibration, and receives a hero's welcome. On November 29, 2012, Nefertiti was placed in what the sources describe as a cozy retirement.
A well-deserved one.
She's put on public display in a custom-built test tube enclosure at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History's Insect Zoo in Washington, D.C.
Earning her place in the archives of space exploration history alongside the greats.
But the dark irony of this entire saga is staggering. She survived the explosive launch. She spent 100 days mastering the vacuum of space. She endured the fiery plummet back through the atmosphere.
And she died just 4 days after going on display at the museum. 4 days. I have to point out how baffling this is. How can an organism conquer the absolute most hostile environment known to science, only to perish 4 days into a luxurious, predator-free retirement?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces us to confront the invisible cellular toll of space travel.
It's not just about surviving the fire of re-entry.
Exactly. When we look at a successful mission, we see the launch and the landing. What we don't see is the systemic fatigue. Think about the immense caloric and neurological energy Nefertiti expended to rewire her brain twice in 104 days.
The biological cost of neuroplasticity.
Surviving the void requires a system running at maximum capacity. When she returned, she faced oxidative stress, potential fluid balances, and an immune system likely compromised by the sheer effort of adaptation.
So she was just exhausted on a cellular level.
The custom enclosure couldn't undo the cellular exhaustion. The environment she was built for ultimately became the environment her fatigued body could no longer handle. It redefines the concept of the right stuff, doesn't it? That kind of endurance applies just as much to these tiny invertebrates as it does to human pilots.
Without a doubt.
But Nefertiti's story doesn't end with her passing in the museum. Her survival, even if brief upon return, opens up a massive conversation in our sources about building actual ecosystems beyond Earth.
We are shifting the scientific focus from merely surviving a trip to establishing permanent residency.
Right. Zooming out from our spider knot, the sources highlight other almost unbelievable survival stories that point toward this future. For instance, scientists attached moss to the absolute exterior of the International Space Station.
Completely exposed to the raw vacuum, just out there.
Yes. No atmosphere, exposed to freezing temperatures and unfiltered solar radiation. And the moss survived out there for 9 months.
It's really hard to wrap your head around.
It is. Think about how you typically view the cosmos. Most of us picture space as this utterly dead, sterile void filled with orbiting rocks and satellites. But human beings are actively figuring out how life, from hardy patches of moss to jumping spiders to humans, can not just visit, but exist out there.
Nature always finds a way to interact with us, too.
Yeah, even when NASA astronauts return home to Earth, they splash down in the ocean and are sometimes greeted by nature. One of our sources highlights a moment where a pod of dolphins swam up to welcome astronauts back after months in orbit. It's this constant, dynamic interaction between Earth biology and the stars.
It's a beautiful image.
So what does this all mean? Are all these seemingly disconnected experiments, the moss on the hull, spiders hunting in the cabin, jellyfish reproducing by the thousands, are these the first rough drafts of a functional Martian ecosystem?
This raises an important question, and it speaks to the core of extraterrestrial botany and biology.
Okay, lay it out for us.
When our sources mention scientists investigating whether certain animals could survive nuclear explosions or exposing moss to the vacuum, we aren't just collecting morbid trivia about extreme resilience.
It's not just to see what survives the apocalypse.
No, we are cataloging the biological building blocks required for a closed-loop ecosystem.
Actually, could you explain the closed-loop concept briefly?
Sure. If humans establish a permanent base on the Moon or Mars, we cannot continuously ship supplies from Earth. It is too expensive and dangerous. We must build ecosystems that sustain themselves.
We have to take Earth with us.
Precisely. We need resilient plants, like that moss or other bryophytes, to process CO2 into oxygen. We need microorganisms to break down waste into usable soil. And crucially, if we are growing crops in extraterrestrial greenhouses, we will inevitably have to deal with pests that stow away on cargo ships.
Wait, are you saying the legacy of Nefertiti is that she might be the prototype for the first Martian exterminator?
Functionally, yes. I mean, we need natural pest control in those agricultural loops because introducing chemical pesticides to a sealed, recycled air environment on Mars would be toxic to the human crew.
Oh, that makes total sense. You can't just spray bug spray in a sealed Martian dome.
Exactly. So understanding how an apex predator like a jumping spider recalibrates its hunting parameters in partial or zero gravity is invaluable data.
Every single strange test is a puzzle piece.
The jellyfish teach us about gravity-sensing reproduction. The moss proves we have hardy flora capable of withstanding radiation events. The spiders show us how a neuroplasticity allows predators to function without their primary environmental cues. We are literally testing the components of a synthetic biosphere.
Now you're taking Earth's weirdest, toughest little survivors, packing them into metal tubes, and watching how they rewrite their own rules.
It's pioneering work, really.
It is. So to recap this incredible 104-day saga, we followed Nefertiti, a fingertip-sized predator, as she went from an earthbound hunter to a zero-gravity master, successfully recalibrating her brain to navigate the void before becoming a permanent fixture in the history of spaceflight.
She proved that the biological imperative to adapt and survive is far stronger than the physical laws of the environment it finds itself in.
She really did. But before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one last thought I want to leave you with, building on everything we've just discussed about neuroplasticity and extreme adaptation. We marveled at how Nefertiti's brain rewired itself in just days, abandoning millions of years of evolutionary instinct to conquer space.
It was a profound demonstration of biological latency.
Exactly that latency. If a tiny spider possesses the dormant ability to calculate orbital mechanics just to catch a fly, it makes you wonder about us.
Oh, absolutely.
What hidden, untapped adaptations are sitting completely dormant inside human DNA? If we push ourselves into the extreme environments of Mars or deep space, what dormant software might suddenly activate in the human brain that we never even knew we had, simply because Earth never required us to use it?
It suggests we might not even know our own true potential until we leave our homeworld behind.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking up, and the next time you see a tiny creature navigating your backyard, remember, it might just have the biological hardware to conquer the stars.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.